Hello, everyone. I'm Emily Moore from thinkstep-anz. I'm really excited to be hosting the next installment in our webinar series. This time we're joined by Sharon from Tetra Pak, who's going to be talking us through the life cycle assessment that we did for them recently. You're really excited to be able to host this one and to discuss this quite large body of work that has been worked on very carefully for quite a few months now. Really excited to bring those outcomes and to talk about our experiences working on that project, and hope that you will learn something today as well. So we've got Sharon Tan, who's the marketing manager at Tetra Pak Oceania, who's joining us today. And then from the ThinkStep side, we've got Jeff Vickers, who's our technical director, who has also supported the project. A bit of Zoom housekeeping, just in case you haven't joined our webinars before. Everyone should be in listen-only mode just to keep that audio quality really good for the recording. If you have any questions and comments, please send that through the Q&A box. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So if you've got any questions that come to your mind while we go, please post it in there anytime. You can post in the chat, but they tend to get quite lost in the chat. So it's much better if you can post it in that Q&A box as well. Sweet. So before we kick off, we just have one poll question that we wanted to share with everyone, just to get a better understanding of everyone's understanding, not only of LCA, but of a comparative LCA. So I will launch that poll now and it should show up on your screen in a moment. Great. So question one is, have you undertaken a comparative LCA for your own product? Some of you may have, maybe you've got ambitions to do so in the future. Maybe you've done a life cycle assessment before, which is fantastic. We love that, but maybe it's not necessarily a comparative one. That's quite a more exhaustive body of work, or perhaps it's not applicable for you. Or maybe you don't know, which is fair enough. Looks like we've got quite a few who have done a comparative LCA, which is really great to see. They're not easy to do. They're quite complex. So that's great that people have invested that much time to get that sort of data. It looks like a few people are planning to do it. Quite a few it's not applicable for, which is fair enough. And then a lower number of people who have done just a life cycle assessment. Perfect. All right, I will close that poll now. Thank you very much, everyone who answered that one. Cool. All right. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jeff Vickers, who's going to talk us through ThinkStep's involvement in the project.
Thanks very much. And thanks all for your time today. I wanted to cover what we did and why in this particular study, and just start by giving you a bit of information on what we call the goal and scope of the life cycle assessment. So in this particular study, we were aiming to do a couple of different things. We wanted to quantify the environmental performance of different beverage packaging options on the shelf in Australia and New Zealand. And we wanted to compare the environmental footprint of those different pack types, and particularly focus on the carbon footprint to see how different pack formats stacked up, where there were relative strengths and weaknesses, and what the sort of overall profile of packaging on the shelf in Australasia was. The standards that we followed for this particular study were ISO 14044, which is the international standard for life cycle assessment, and ISO 14067, which is the international standard for product carbon footprinting. And I just wanted to mention that this is an update to a study we did 5 years ago. I was looking back the other day and I realized that this webinar is exactly 5 years on from the webinar we had to launch the previous study. So it's kind of a bit of a deja vu to kind of be looking at this again 5 years later. So what did we consider? We looked at a range of different things. And I think something that's worth being aware of with this study, when you're looking at other comparative life cycle assessments for beverage packaging, is a lot of other studies will normalize all the results to a litre of beverage being delivered. We deliberately didn't do that for this project. And the reason we didn't do that is that each of those different product or pack formats are serving a completely different function. And so if you had a 2 litre bottle of milk or a 1 litre bottle of milk, that's quite different to a 200 ml single serve pack. And so we were looking at different functional purposes, and we've compared them all separately for a reason. And the reason is just simply that they're not competing with each other, right? A single serve pack is very different to a bulk pack that you're going to take home and serve out of. The products that we considered in the study, we looked at white milk, we looked at ready-to-drink coffees, we looked at food supplement nutrition as a category, and we looked at juice. Some changes to the categories that we considered last time. Some have stayed, some have been changed out. We looked at a range of packaging formats. So we looked at fresh and we looked at aseptic, but we also looked at aseptic packaging that then gets chilled. And when we were looking at how we would gather the information, we essentially just went out to stores, to supermarkets, to buy different pack formats. So we were looking at what's available on the market. So we looked at buying cartons, we looked at buying plastic bottles. The plastic bottles are a range of different types. There's PET, there's recycled PET, there's HDPE. We also were looking at glass bottles, we looked at pouches, and we looked at aluminium cans and can bottles, bottle cans. Okay, and When we were looking at the study, we tried to consider the entire packaging life cycle. So we're not only considering the primary pack, the thing that's actually got the beverage or food in it, but we're also considering the secondary packaging, so any wraps, anything that might be on the shelf, and then finally the tertiary packaging, like we're looking at, the pallets that these things are going on. So generally speaking, most of the packs are the primary pack that you take home. There's a secondary packaging, which is typically a corrugated carton to get a set of packs to the shelf, and then there's the pallet that the overall bulk products are going out on. There's a diagram here to show the life cycle, but we've got a few slides later to kind of talk through that in more detail. In terms of how we did this, I mentioned that we went and we purchased packs, and the reason was because we wanted to get real masses for products that are actually on the market. So we went out and bought 86 packs from retailers in Australasia. We emptied them all out, we cleaned them, we dried them, and then we weighed them. We split all of them up into their component parts. So we said, here's the bottle, here's the cap, here's the label, here's other parts of a closure, for example. And then we modeled the supply chain for each one. So we said, okay, if it's PET, there's a series of steps that a PET bottle will go through to be produced. We might produce a preform through injection molding. That preform will get shipped out, it will get blow molded, then that will get filled with whatever the beverage is, then a cap will be put on, and then it will be put into secondary packaging, tertiary packaging, out to the store, and then used, and then going to end of life. And so we looked at what are the different steps that the pack needs to go through, and specifically what are the weights of real packs that are available in Australasia within the last year. For cartons, we took a slightly different approach. We have data from Tetra Pak on what their specifications are, so we know how much the packs weigh before we even start. We did actually get some off the shelf to cross-check that those pack masses were right, and then we modeled that data. Rather than using generic information, we used real data from Tetra Pak's supply chain. Once we'd done that, we analyzed all the results and we made comparisons across each different product category. And as I mentioned before, we're looking category by category rather than per litre of beverage, because when you do look per litre of beverage, what you typically find is that bigger bulk packs are more efficient, but that's pretty obvious before you started. We're quite interested in what the comparisons are inside each category. Once we've done the analysis, we prepared a really long detailed report and also a nutshell summary, which I'll cover in a bit. And we went through a quite rigorous panel review process with a panel of 3 independent experts. They provided feedback, we had to address it, that went round a few times, and then when they were happy, we issued our final report, which has got their review statement attached. So in terms of what we found through this and the kind of information that the study shows, effectively what we're doing is we're trying to look at the whole life cycle of packaging. We're trying to understand where the impacts are coming from. And if we look at a particular category, so if I took milk 1 litre in Australia as an example, and I was to focus in on, sorry, I just clicked too many times there. If I focused in on HDPE 1 litre as an example, and we go around this diagram, so we start with raw material production, so that's extraction of oil and then making the raw HDPE granulate that goes into manufacturing. Then the manufacturing is your blow molding of the bottle, for example. And then we've got transport to the filling location where the bottle was filled. We've got all the forming and filling stages that need to happen. We've got the shipper and pallet packaging. We've got the distribution to the store. And finally, what we've got end of life. And one of the things that you can see is that the impacts are really front loaded towards the beginning of the life cycle. So when the pack is made, so we've got an HDPE bottle and a closure cap, we've already contributed, significant chunk of our total footprint. It's about 3/4 just up until that point. And the rest of the stuff that happens matters, but it matters less. And so I think when people think of packaging, I think probably the first things that come to mind are waste. And what you can see there is that the waste impact, at least from a carbon footprint perspective, which is what this is showing, is relatively small. I think people also get quite caught up on the idea of food miles and transport of things, but you can see here the distribution components aren't massive in terms of the overall footprint. The biggest contribution from this particular HDPE bottle is actually making it. So making the raw material and then blow molding it to get to a bottle. If we go to a comparative product, the Tetra Rex 1 litre, what you can see is a slightly different profile, but the same kind of overall conclusions. Most of the impact is up front. In this case, there's more impact spread through the life, and at end of life, the impact's relatively low. The reason why this profile is a bit different through the rest of the life cycle is not that the Tetra Pak product is high impact to transport, it's just that the overall emissions are lower. It's a lighter weight pack, and its overall impact is quite a bit lower from a carbon footprint perspective. And so as a result, the contribution from the transport is more significant for this particular one. But it gives you an idea of where your impacts are, and what you can see is it's that front loading. So this here, and then going back to the HDPE, you can see you've got really significant loading at the front of the life cycle. Okay, so One of the challenges with life cycle assessment, and particularly with comparative life cycle assessment, is if you're going through the standards and ticking all the boxes, we have so many things that we have to do, and the reports balloon out to be hundreds and hundreds of pages, and they're really, really technical, and I appreciate they're not really fun to read. So what we've prepared in this case is what we call a nutshell study. It's a short summary of the report that picks out a lot of the key findings and puts them in a way that we hope is more digestible. The challenge with a life cycle assessment report is we do have to comply with the standards. They're really dry, they're really boring things to read, a lot of tables, a lot of charts. They're important and we need them to get through that review process and to document what we've done, but it is really hard to get into. And so these nutshell summaries we find are a good way of trying to pull out the key information and make it more accessible. So with that, I will hand over to Sharon from Tetra Pak.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so let me just start. Before I go into the LCA findings, I'd like to just take a moment to introduce Tetra Pak for those who don't know. So we are a global organization, and we basically, one of the key purpose in terms of Tetra Pak purpose is really to make food safe and available for everyone. And that's a purpose that we're really proud of. And because we're talking about sustainability, it's really built into our ethos. And the way we do that is you'll see how we design our solutions that delivers to sustainability goals. Yeah. Now, the other thing to take note of is also the business. So the Tetra Pak is really distinctly in three core businesses. So we are in processing, packaging, and services. For those who don't know, I think we're most well known for our packages. But really, we also have filling equipments, we have processing equipments, and obviously with the equipments, we also have the after-sales services, which is a very important component of our business. Yeah. So that's to give a little bit of a highlight on what the business is all about. The next thing is, if I can just give you an idea. So whilst we are a global company, we do have local presence. So in Oceania, we do have two offices. One is in Melbourne and one's in Hamilton. And the good thing is that we do have also global expertise. And I think this part is really critical to note, because when we talk about LCA, we talk about the environmental performance, and the environmental performance is really influenced by local conditions. So local conditions like the electricity mix, like the transport and the end-of-life treatment. Yeah, that is very unique to the market conditions. So similarly to the way we are set up, we have that global expertise, but we are also rooted in local presence, so we understand the local presence really well. So that's a little bit about Tetra Pak. Now I get to present the findings, which is the exciting part. For those who have not done a life cycle assessment, just to give you an understanding what it is really a method for evaluating the environmental impacts of a product, a process, or packaging, or even services throughout its entire life cycle. So starting from the raw material extraction all the way to disposal, or what we call the end-of-life treatment. So it's really the journey, as Jeff has shown earlier on. And I'm showing it again because it's important for us to note that this journey is starting all the way from the raw material extraction till the end of life. And because we put the different packaging in here, so the different packaging will have different percentages or different activity in each one of these elements. And this is why it's interesting to see how they all perform in terms of the cartons, the Tetra Pak cartons, vis-a-vis this other packaging types in the market. Now, the first important insight to note is, on an average, 98% of the impact occurs before the packaging even hits the shelf. So that's a very, very important insight. I think most of us will pay a lot more attention to the end of life, which is recycling. But suffice to say that when you do a full life cycle analysis, you will see that the raw material extraction, the manufacturing of the packaging, the conversion, the forming and filling actually takes quite a lot of carbon emission. So it emits a lot of carbon emission, and that sits very much in the production space. And then the distribution is really about transporting the packages to the sites, and that's about 3%. But in all, 98% of that really happens at the first two stages, so on the upstream, okay, rather than the downstream. So that's insight number one. Now, The other thing to take note of is that there are two slides to this. One is I'm showing the aseptic or ambient, and then later on, I'm showing the chill, and then later I'll be showing you the ambient. So if you look at the different packaging types that we tested, so we had glass, we had HDPE, rPET, and carton. In Australia and New Zealand, you will see that carton has got the lowest carbon footprint in Australia and one of the lowest in New Zealand for the chill. Similarly, if you look at the ambient, we have glass, we have PET, we have carton, the same storyline here. So we do have the lowest carbon footprint in both markets. Okay, and that's pleasing to see because of the way the carton is actually manufactured. It's a lightweight. We also obviously deliver it through an optimized palletization. Okay, so that all contributes to the lower carbon footprint. Now, whilst we have all these findings, I think it's also imperative and important for business to understand how to use this and how do we leverage on these findings as a competitive edge. There are a few things. Let's start with the first one, which is the lower environmental impact through efficiency. I think the key thing to note here is whilst we understand the life cycle and the full life cycle of the packaging, this is where we can identify the hotspots in which we have an opportunity to reduce energy, even look at the materials that we develop, and even transportation. So that gives you an idea on which of the levers you need to pull in order to reduce that and to improve efficiency. So that's point number one. Point number two is obviously, whilst we understand these pain points, we also will know where are the areas in which we can improve in terms of the design of the packaging. So here is where we want to ensure that we go into a more lightweight kind of packaging. So looking at renewables, looking at more recycled content or even bio-based. So that will help to bring the carbon footprint lower. So it's, again, understanding that component of packaging in terms of the design innovation and see where is it that we can improve further. The other thing that's really important for customers and also for brands is that, there is a lot of need for us to have database and scientific data to back this study. And I think with an LCA, the data is all verified, and that gives you a proof point in terms of building your brand trust. So that's an element that we also need to verify, and that really helps to improve the equity of the brand. The next one is to reduce regulatory and compliance risk. And here is where we need to be a lot more proactive rather than reactive because of the evolving regulatory landscape that's changing so often. And this sort of future-proof in terms of the business and in terms of preparing what may come our way. Yeah. And the last one is having the improved customer and relationship with retailers. Now, what it does here is that with this kind of study, it can really put you in a position of a preferred supplier with a retailer because you are doing things to show progress and accountability and obviously meeting the retailer sustainability scorecard. So that's important to note. So these are 5 of the reasons where when you do an LCA and you use the LCA to your advantage, you can position yourself in a much better light. Now, the last slide I have here is the opportunities. If there are marketers in this call, some opportunities in where you can have some communication claims. So these are just very broad strokes on what we can claim, and I have parked them in 3 buckets. So there is a carbon and climate claims, which you can basically talk about reducing carbon footprint through lighter packaging, or you can have like lower climate impact verified by LCA. So these are just some flavor and examples of what could come under the banner of carbon and climate claims. And then from the packaging and waste claim, obviously made with renewable materials is something that you can claim on pack or on your website, or use less materials than fossil-based packaging. Okay. The last one is resource and efficiency, and this really signals growth and also operational efficiencies when you talk about using less energy to produce or maybe even having more efficient production process. So these are just some very broad highlights on claims that could come under some of these different buckets if you do an LCA. And back to you, Emily. for any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Sharon and Jeff, for walking us through the LCA. Really good to see that you've had these epiphanies about your products as well, looking at how a lot of the impacts actually happen really upstream in the manufacturing process rather than downstream. So yeah, it's great to see that you've identified that and you can use that information for your business advantage, which we love. We're going to move on to the Q&A segment of the webinar. And I will check to see if we've had any questions coming through the Q&A.
There are some there.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
here we go. We've got them. Yay, that's good. Awesome. Oh, there's quite a few in here, actually, which is fantastic. So I am going to start. Where do I want to start? I'll start with this one. And I think, Jeff, this will be a question for you, most probably. This one is asking, how do the technology differences and places of raw material sourcing affect the LCA results? I would like to know whether you have conducted any sensitivity analysis on those.
Yeah, so yeah, they do have an effect. We tried to understand what the key things that affect the results are. So if you take something like PET, one of the key things that drives the results down is how much recycled PET there is. So there's quite a few more recycled PET packs in the market now than there used to be. And so we tried to look at what are the things that are really driving changes in performance and tried to understand those. So what we've tried to do as best as we can is model the supply chain as we believe it actually exists. So looking at where materials are sourced from, how they're transported, where the locations of manufacture are likely to be. And then as you say, like we have done sensitivity analysis as part of a comparative study you're required to. And so there's a whole section about sensitivity analyses looking at different variables that are important to the results and seeing if they change the conclusions or not. So the full report has that kind of detail in it.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Jeff. We've got another question about what alternatives we were looking at in the comparison. So Jeff or Sharon, this could probably go to either of you. The question is, were reusable options included as one of the alternatives?
So they weren't. This is a study just comparing single-use packaging only. So the scope that we drew from the beginning was a single-use study. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Sharon?
No, go on, Jeff.
Yeah, no, so it's single-use packs only in this study. Yeah.
Sweet. Easy. Cool. And I guess that kind of leads to, there's another question about maybe, Sharon, how Tetra Pak defines what renewable material is, whether that's relevant for the scope of this life cycle assessment we did. I'm not too sure, but I'll leave that with you.
Yeah, so what was the question?
How does Tetra Pak specifically define renewable material?
Renewable in terms of lightweight, and renewable could also be bio-based, so the plant-based kind of materials that we have. So that will be what we define as renewable.
Perfect. Yep. Thank you for that, Sharon. Awesome. There's a question about the slides being shared, and yes, they will be shared after the webinar. So that's all good. Well, they'll be shared in the format of the webinar recording. So that will go onto our website in a few weeks. Sweet. Cool. This is more of a comment rather than a question, but I think I'll share it. Someone's learnt a few months ago that there are Tetra Pak recycling spots in Auckland. So this is a PSA not to throw them in your regular bin. Thank you very much for that. It's good to get the word out there. Perfect. Cool. And I think we are about to hit time. So I'm going to call it there. But thank you very much, Sharon and Jeff, for presenting today. I'm going to share screen again just to conclude. So bear with me. Okay, great. So again, thank you to Sharon and Jeff for presenting on the Tetra Pak LCA refresh with us. I'm sure we all learnt a lot about comparative LCA and then also what the outcomes mean for Tetra Pak. Just a few reminders, we've got an upcoming webinar for our disclosure kit, which is a new service offering from us, which we're all very excited about at ThinkStep. So if you're thinking of doing your climate-related disclosures soon, or you have to, feel free to check that out. We do have an upcoming course in Sydney as well. So this has been run several times last year by Nicole, who's our impact director, and then Barbara, our CEO. And it's all about not how to do your own life cycle assessment, but how to actually use the results from your LCA. So, Sharon's indicated that there are all these changes that they can assess from their side of the business, from the LCA that we've done. So if you want to also take your existing LCA and learn how you can use the outcomes, this will be the course for you as well, assuming that you're based in Sydney or will be in Sydney on the 12th of May. A few other things coming soon. So we've got our MCI Pro, which will be released very soon. This was in a pilot for a couple of months and is a continuation of our previously free tool as well. So if you're interested in doing circularity assessments for your products, that's something to check out. And Disclosure Kit, just a reminder that you can now see that on our website as well. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
We have many more webinar replays on a whole host of sustainability topics. You can check them out on our website and our YouTube channel.